Okay, this presentation is going to be an overview of this document that you see here. And it encompasses about 5 decades of scientific research. And I think it's the most comprehensive and factual book on the Shroud that I'm aware of today. And you'll see it squeezed into about 45 minutes here. You've got a couple copies in your media center already. I ask you to take a look at that. That's the format we'll follow. You'll be reading on your own today. I won't be reading to you all the time. Okay, let's begin with an orientation of how the body would have been wrapped in the shroud according to Jewish burial customs, all right? It would have been placed in the tomb in a way similar to what you see here. A long linen wrap was laid on the ground or a stone, the body placed on it. It was wrapped over the head so that both open ends are there at the feet. And then to keep it on the body, you would take one long strip and tie it off at the head, a couple times around the body, and once more at the feet, as you see here before it was put in the tomb. All right, now what we're going to do is, for those of you that came in and wonder, what are we looking at here? This is the shroud, all right? But it's very, very faint. So what we've done is, I've taken this side of the body, the left side of the body, we've taken a photographic negative of it, and that's what it looks like. Everybody can see the details pretty well up there. Now, if you rotate it clockwise 90 degrees, then this is what we're looking at on the shroud here. On the left half of the shroud, can you see the face there? For people over here, there's the face right there on the left half of the shroud. You can see the arms crossed. See the arms crossed? You can see the blood flow coming out of the wrist. All right? And what I'm going to do now is switch from this high contrast image to the shroud. If I would encourage you to maybe focus on the face, focus on the face up there, and we'll go to the real thing. Okay? And you can see it's a very faint image. The shroud itself is 14 feet, 3 inches long by 3 feet, 7 inches, which is exactly 8 cubits by 2 cubits. The Syrian cubit was a conventional measurement used at that time, about 21 inches, right? And we see this mysterious image of a man's front part of the body and then also the back side of his body here. What we're going to do is to get into more details of this here. If we look at the Gospel of Mark, he says this. I invite you to read that. And in this artist's drawing, on the lower portion, you see the body being brought down from the cross on Good Friday, wrapped. And then at the top, you see at the shroud is opened up after Easter Sunday with an image on it. So the question is the Shroud of Turin, is it that image spoken of in the Gospels? Okay, what we're going to do is look at the left side first. There's the left side. Can you see the front of the body there? And if you look right here where the laser's at, the reason they can't use the laser on those screens is it doesn't reflect from there. I can get it to come off the wall, but I lose it there otherwise, right? Okay, there you see a blood stain. We believe that is the blood from the lance wound that went into his side. You see the arms crossed. You can see the blood stain from the exit wound. And we have some water stains here. These marks here are from a fire in 1532. It was folded in 16 and 32 layers, and a piece of melted silver went through and put those holes, so that's what these patches are. Okay? The man on the shroud is 5 feet, 10 inches tall, and weighed about 170 pounds. Now we're going to look at the right half of the shroud. And there you see the blood stains from the back of the head. Up there, it's on your far left. You see the scourge marks across the back, going down the legs. You can see the blood coming off the right foot, blood coming off the left foot. Up in the corners, that is a backing that was sewn on in the 16th century because the corners had worn away. And then you see these things here called poker holes. We'll get to them later. So I hope we got you all oriented now to what we're looking at, all right? This is a replica. There are less than 50 of these in the world. The real one, of course, is in Turin. I don't have the real one here for you. This is a replica. It might be the closest you ever get. This is the stitching pattern that we find on it. It is a uniquely Jewish pattern found in Palestine at the time of Christ. It's called the 3-in-1 herringbone weave. You go over 3 threads and under 1, over 3 and under 1, and then you shift 1 thread. And if you look on the left, it produces this stair-step pattern. And we're going to see that in artwork in later centuries, all right? And by the way, although this was found in the Holy Land and still found there today, it was never found in Europe at any time in history. Now, what you see on the left is what we call the cloth image. And on the right is called the photographic negative. Right? If you take a picture of the face, that's what it looks like in a photographic negative. Right, that's on the left. But of course on the cloth it's very faint. Now along with that, we're still there? Okay, good. I can't see that from there. If you think about left hand and right hand, if the image went on the cloth some way, it looks like my right hand, doesn't it? But it was really the left hand. So the image that we see on the cloth is a mirror image. And what you see on your right up there in the photographic negative would be what the face really looked like. So that blood stain would have looked like a 3, see? But when it goes onto the cloth and you pull it away, it looks like a backwards 3. So we get oriented that way now? Okay, and that, by the way, that circle at the top of the head, that is a water stain, and that is not part of the image. If you look at the cheeks, look at the right cheek on the photographic negative. See how it's lighter in color? It's puffed out. The forensic pathologist for Los Angeles County has studied this, and he confirms that right cheek shows significant swelling compared to the left. And if you look at the right in the smack dab in the center of his chin, can you see that little black circle? The beard has been pulled out. And in the book of Isaiah, we read, I gave my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled my beard, my face I did not shield from buffets. The image on the shroud is a physical manifestation of how that prophecy was fulfilled. I invite you to read this. And on the right, you see the scourge marks going across the back. Hope I left you enough time to read there. Now, this scourging would have been done with a flagrum. Like you see on the left, there are 4 flagrums currently on display in a museum in Rome. This one appears to be consistent with the wounds because the wounds show these 2 little round marks a certain distance apart. Right? And then on the right, you see some crucifixion nails. There's actually a second type of crucifixion nail as well. There you see a close-up of the scourge marks. And this scourging was mercilessly done. It would have left the victim in shock from loss of blood. They have counted 159 wounds on the front of the body and, 213 on the back for a total of 372 wounds on the shroud. But they were more than that because there's no side images. There's no side images on the shroud. And what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the wounds on all 4 of these quadrants of the body. This might be the only time in your life you get to see this, so I hope you are able to soak this in here. Starting with the front of the body. Okay, we see the blood across the face. We see scourge marks across the chest, all the way down the front of the body. That diamond thing you see in his chest, that's a water stain. That's a water stain, all right, across the chest. And look on his right side. You see that white patch? It corresponds to, whoops, back up here. It corresponds to right there. That blood stain, it appears to be on his left side, but it's on the right side. That's the blood that exuded from the lance wound in the side. It's a post-mortem wound. He was truly dead. The blood had already separated. And in ultraviolet light, you can see that. And then you see the arms crossed, and you see the exit wound. That white patch on his wrist is blood, right? That would have been up against the cross. That's where the nail came out. We're not sure where it went in. Here's the rest of the front of the body. You see the hands at the top, another water stain, and then scourge marks all the way down to the feet. All right, this is a close-up of the back, and you can see the blood all over the head. It wasn't a nice, perfectly symmetric round circle crown. It was probably just a clump of thorns pushed over his head like a ball cap, because we see blood wounds coming all over the head. And then if you look down the middle at the top, look at the hair. Can you see the hair? It goes halfway down his back. See it? Past his shoulders, past his shoulder blades. First century Jews did not cut their hair. And even today, many Jews do not cut their hair. So it's likely, based on the man of the shroud, that Jesus would have had long hair, like the Jewish men of his time. If you look at the scourge marks across there, they're very distinct on the lower back, aren't they? But look up around the shoulders. Can you see that it's a little more blurry and disfigured? All right? This is consistent with if you had been scourged and then you had to carry something across your shoulders, whether it was a single patibulum, weighing 60 to 80 pounds, or an entire cross weighing perhaps 180 pounds, the weight of that beam across his shoulders as he moved, and it moved, and he fell, would mutilate those scourge marks. So my point here is that this is consistent with a scourging followed by carrying something across your shoulders. And then here we see the rest of the scourge marks going all the way down both legs, and 2 blood wounds coming off the right foot and 1 on the left there. Now this is a close-up at the small of the back, where the laser's at right now. And what's unique about this is that the blood is still red. If you've ever seen a bloody nose on the playground or whatever, when blood goes out of the body, it turns dark. Within a day, it's brown, and then it's black, and it should be dark. How is it that this blood can still be bright red after all these centuries? Well, in the 20th century, it was discovered that when a person suffers a severe loss of blood, 10, 20, 40% of their blood volume, then the body responds, and that the liver produces a unique protein called bilirubin, which goes into the bloodstream for the purpose of speeding up the release of oxygen. It bursts the red blood cells so oxygen can get to the oxygen-starved tissues to try and keep you alive, all right? This bright red protein, however, once it leaves the body, like onto a cloth, it will stay red till the end of time. So my point here is this. This is not just blood from any man. This is blood from a man who suffered a severe trauma and loss of blood. And there you see the second type of crucifixion now at the top there. You know, if we stop to think of the unspeakable pain of having nails driven through our Lord's hand and feet, we can begin to appreciate, the great love that he has for each of us. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, as he considered this, what was going to happen to him, he understood what this is going to be like. Fear of the unknown is bad enough, but Jesus had a human nature and a divine nature. So can you imagine fear of the completely understood? To know how every nerve and cell and muscle and fiber in your body was going to react to this impending passion. And the anxiety, imagine the terror. And this terror was so great that it caused him to sweat blood, a very rare condition we know as hematidrosis. The word excruciate means to torment, and excruciating means extreme anguish or pain. This nailing is one type of crucifixion that was done. They had more than one way of nailing. That's one way it could have been done. We know the exit wound is near the wrist. The exact point of entrance is a conjecture. And hanging in this crucifixion position would lead to extreme pain in the shoulders and arms. This was verified in a simulated crucifixion experiments done by volunteer Air Force cadets in Colorado Springs. All right. Also, the chest, because your arms are pulled out, your chest is constricted, which makes breathing more difficult. So the answer would be to try and push up on your impaled feet, and that would cause pain. And there was no escape from the pain, whether you were trying to breathe in or breathe out. You went from one agony to the next. There was no respite. Now we're going to look at a feature called superficiality, which means it's very, very faint. All right, this image is very faint. This slide is magnified 32 times, and it shows you the close-ups of the threads. These threads are as small as the threads on your buttons, all right, but they're greatly magnified here. Now, this is the darkest area of the shroud that you're seeing up there, right on the nose. And yet, even this gives a hint just to how superficial it really is. These colored linen fibers that you see are colored only due to some type of chemical reaction that involves the fibers themselves. There's no evidence of any paint or extraneous dye or coating on them. There's no stuff to make the image. It's just simply there. Now, what we're going to do is take one of those threads and chop it off, and we're going to look at it end on. Okay, we're going to look at a cross-section of one of those threads. It has maybe 70 to 120 little microfibrils. Do you see the yellow area at the very top? Those are the only image-bearing areas of the entire thread. Only the uppermost portions of those microscopic fibrils are colored. All right? The blood, of course, goes all the way through and soaks through all those circles. But to give you an idea of the superficiality here, that's just a single thread. That yellow area is 0.2 of a micron thick. Now, a paperclip is 1 millimeter, okay? There's 1,000 microns in 1 millimeter. And this image is only 0.2 of 1 micron. So this is one of the many traits about the shroud that no artist can duplicate. We simply can't make something so thin and superficial, all right? There's Dr. Jackson measuring the thickness of the shroud back in 1978. It is, the shroud itself is 1/3 of a millimeter thick. This is the same diameter as the smallest string on a guitar. For those of you that play guitar, the string number 6, that E, is 1/3 of a millimeter. That's how thin the shroud is. And that little wire has 70 to 120 microscopic fibers. Right? We're turning to archaeology. These are the steps of Jerusalem, from the temple that Jesus would have seen in his lifetime. Now, of course, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, but these steps have been preserved to this day. And on the shroud, we find dirt in 3 areas on the shroud: on the nose, on the knees, and on the soles of the feet. 3 parts of our Lord body that would have been in contact with the ground on Good Friday show up in those areas on the shroud. It's a very unique type of earth called travertine aragonite, and it's found only in Jerusalem and a handful of places on earth. Okay, we go from geology to botany. That is Dr. Max Frey. He is a Swiss criminologist in the middle there, and next to him is Ray Rogers. Now in his hand, he's got a red thing. That is a masking tape, or excuse me, it's just regular Scotch tape, okay? And he's taking tape samples off the shroud, and they hope to pull off pollen grains. And then by analyzing those pollen grains, you can tell what kind of plants has this been exposed to, and even what time of year they were. And it just so happens that after analyzing these pollen samples, he found over 200 of them, and there were 49 different kinds. And 13 of those species were unique to Jerusalem, and several other species were unique to Constantinople. And so from this, he concludes that these pollen grains give a pretty wide spectrum, that the shroud, during its history, had been in the Holy Land, it had been in Turkey, and it had been in France, and it had been in Italy. One of the most mysterious features of the shroud is that it encodes 3D information. This picture you see on the right is the only picture on Earth that will give that image. It was taken by taking this picture right here and putting it underneath a VP8 image analyzer. Now, NASA designed the VP8 when they mapped the surface of the moon. Back around 1970, we didn't know what the backside of the moon looked like, see, because the same side of the moon is always facing us. You've never seen the backside of the moon, okay? And so when they mapped the moon, the VP8 measures light intensities to see where the valleys and hills are, but a normal picture doesn't contain that information. However, the shroud does. This contains light intensity information. And the most important point we get from this is that there is a direct correlation between the image density, how dark it is, and the vertical distance between the cloth and the body at the moment of the image was formed. So like the nose was in direct contact with the cloth, it's raised, isn't it? But the eyes are a few millimeters back and they're sunk in. So somehow we have to account for this light image density 3D information when we go to try to explain how is the image formed, all right? And that was the picture that inspired Dr. Jackson to undertake the Shroud of Turin research project. On the right is the chapel. That's on the campus of the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. And in the basement, there's an entire body that shows this 3D, not just the face, but the entire body. John was an eyewitness on Easter morning, so I invite you to read, what did John see? And if you notice in yellow, it says linen wrappings. He's speaking in the plural. What did he see? Perhaps John and Peter saw something like this: the shroud, and then can you see that winding strip on the lower left, about 4 inches wide, it goes around a couple times, and then a headcloth rolled up into place by itself. And the gospel says he looked and saw and believed. What did he see? He didn't get to see the image because the image was on the inside of the cloth. He saw that the outside wrapping was still on it. That's why he saw and believed, right? Now we've looked at the shroud. Let's look at this long strip in the headcloth, right? We know on the shroud that at some point there's a strip here. If you follow the laser, it comes down about 3 inches. That's where the yellow arrows are out there. You can see it very clearly. At some point, that long strip that usually was wrapped around the body went into the tomb. You never saw it again. On Easter morning, it was preserved with the shroud, and someone sewed it back on. Right? And that stitching pattern has been found to match a stitching pattern from the caves of Masada from the 1st century. Right? Textile expert Michel Fleury-Lemberg has confirmed that. So you wonder who sewed that back on. We don't know. But, I think about this and I thought, could it have been the Virgin Mary? Moms do that kind of thing. I don't know for sure, but I can't think of anybody more likely to have done that than his mother. We may never know. Now, it makes sense to have this side stream because you need some way of keeping it on the body. Jews did not bury the body like a mummy. That was the Egyptians. The Egyptians had lots of tiny strips wrapped really tightly. Jews to this day continue to bury their dead the way they always have, with a long shroud clipped over the head, and then one end tied off around the chin, and then wrapped around the body a couple times, and the feet. That keeps the linen on the body. And that 14-foot strip would be sufficient for that. Okay, what about the headcloth rolled up in a place by itself, right? We believe this to be that headcloth. Covering the face with a headcloth would have been in accordance with Jewish sensibilities for 2 reasons. Number one, as he was being taken down from the cross, right, it covered his face and preserved his dignity. Even in hospital shows today, they cover the face. People in all cultures do that. But blood was coming out of his eyes, his ears, his nose, his mouth. And in Jewish culture, blood is considered part of the body. And so they wanted to capture all of his body. Right? They carry him to the tomb, set him down, and they pull this headcloth off. And that would have been the headcloth rolled up in a place by itself on Good Friday. We don't see any image on it. You see the blood stains, but that's because you don't see image of the body because it was not on the body at the moment the image formed, which we believe may have been Easter morning. Now, what we can do is we compare. By the way, this is called the Sudarium of Oviedo, and it was carried into Spain in the 7th century to avoid the Persians that were trying to capture the Holy Land at that time. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare the Sudarium with the shroud. Right? Now, on the left is the shroud. These are the bloodstains right here in the back of the head. And on the right is the Sudarium. And these are transparencies, 1-to-1 scale. We're going to overlap them. Look what happens when we overlap these two. There are several areas where the bloodstains match up together. This is considered first-class scientific evidence. Scientists are in agreement that the shroud and the Sudarium wrap the same person at the same time because these bloodstains match up. And they're both type AB blood. And the Sudarium also has travertine argonite on it from the shroud, and it also has similar pollen grains that we found on the shroud. So these are evidences that put the Sudarium together with the shroud pretty well. So what happened to the shroud after the resurrection? Well, it's not unusual that we don't hear much about it because if it had been advertised, it likely would have been confiscated, right? You don't hear a word about the Blessed Virgin Mary in the Acts of the Apostles. Why? If her whereabouts were made known, she may have been, killed. And so they kept quiet about this type of thing. But in 44 AD, we know that there was a persecution in Jerusalem, and as people fled, one of those people that left Jerusalem was St. Peter. And Peter came to Antioch in 44 AD. And St. Jerome has a text that states that Peter brought with him the burial linens of the dead and risen one. Right? And it stayed there for about 5 centuries. And then the Persians attacked in 540. They attacked Antioch. And it appears that the bishop of Antioch, Bishop Ephraimius, probably rescued the shroud on horseback, getting it out just before the Assyrians attacked. Right? And he planned on coming back for it, but he died before that. And so it stays in central Turkey. And about this time, we're going to see a picture here of what we believe was one of the earlier pictures of Christ from the shroud. And in 574, the emperor at Constantinople had appropriated the shroud to come to Constantinople. Constantinople had this big palace. It had hundreds of relics of saints. It was like the Rome of the Byzantine world, right? Now, there's another theory that says instead of going through Antioch, it went through Edessa. And in Edessa, there was an image known as the Mandylion that got there in 944. So it's still an open question, but many scientists believe those were two separate things. But that being said, that is an open question. All right, now here's a picture I think most of you are familiar with. You recognize that? This is an icon found in both the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. There have been many variations of it. It's called the Pantocrator icon, Christ ruler of all. And it's been reliably dated to about the year 550 AD. It was found at the foot of Mount Sinai, where Moses got the Ten Commandments. That's where this picture was found, along with about 1,000 other pictures. And when they match up this face to the shroud, there's some remarkable resemblances. In a court of law, if you have 45 to 60 points of congruence, that's enough to confirm that two images are the same person. On the shroud, Dr. Alan Wanger found there are more than 150 points of congruence, the only difference being that the eyes are open and on the shroud they're closed. That face is asymmetrical. Look at one cheek, doesn't look like the other, nor does the shroud. So we don't know who made that picture, but they had to have been looking at the shroud. That's the point we're trying to make with this. And there's some more to this here. What does the rest of the picture look like? Well, the right hand is raised in blessing. That is the mercy of God. The artist was trying to convey the two attributes of God, the mercy of God, the right hand raised in blessing. Now his left hand is holding the book. That's the law. That's the justice of God. And so the mercy and justice of God are exhibited on the Pantocrator icon. And one other thing, take a look at those eyes. If you look at the eyes, perhaps you'll see the contrast that the artist was trying to show you between the mercy of God on the left and the justice of God on the right. All right, we go to the year 692, the Justinian, the second coin. Notice the collar area. This is just one of many areas that are congruent here, where the coin appears to match the shroud pretty well. They've actually measured the nose distance and eye-to-eye distance, and it's a perfectly 1.00 to 1.28 ratio. And no other coin of Christ matches that. Only the ones made in Constantinople. Another reason why we believe the shroud was in Constantinople. Okay? The year 1192. This parchment you see on the left is about 10 inches by 6 inches wide. It is the oldest surviving parchment in the country of Hungary. It's in a library museum in Budapest, Hungary. And the top picture is showing us Good Friday. Okay, there you see the body. It's on the linen. You see the hands are crossed, right hand over the left, which is what we see on the shroud. We see only 4 fingers, which is what we see on the shroud, but the lower picture actually has more detail. The lower picture is showing us Easter Sunday. The body's gone, the angel's pointing to the empty linen. The women are arriving at the tomb. Those red crosses represent bloodstains, all right? And inside that circle, there are 2 more details. You remember a few dozen slides back, I showed you the 3-in-1 herringbone weave, that stair-step pattern. The artist had to have been looking at the shroud to get that stair-step pattern and these 4 holes. So when you match that up with the shroud, it's a pretty good match. What you see on the right there is right here, all right? These are those holes. And we find those holes in 4 places, so we know how the shroud was wrapped, all right? 1 would be on top, and when you fold this, this becomes a mirror image of it. That's 2, that's 3, and that's 4. This is on top, this is on the bottom. So if it's folded like this, what does that look like? Well, you fold it in half, then fold it in half again, and at that point, it looks like you see there. And if you're wondering what this table was doing out here, here's what it's for. This sheet is the same size as that shroud, right? It's 8 cubits by 2 cubits, and I folded it into fourths the way you see it up there. That make sense? Okay. Notice how conveniently this would fit over an altar. And those holes show up smack dab in the center, right? What would you be doing with a shroud on an altar? Well, if you think back to every Mass you've ever seen, the priest unfolds a white linen corporal, right? It's got 9 squares. You've seen it before? All right? And the chalice and the host are consecrated on it. The body of Jesus on that linen corporal gets back to the body of Jesus resurrecting from the shroud on Easter morning. Right? Because we believe we receive a risen Jesus. We don't receive the dead Jesus. we receive a risen Lord. So the next time you see at Mass that linen corporal, that's where it comes from. It came from Easter morning and our belief that Christ rose from the linen shroud. What about those holes? How did those holes get there? Well, imagine that the shroud that is being venerated, and we've got some coals burning, and it was probably a primitive bowl that probably didn't have a nice top like the ones we've got, and they're incensing, right? And the side of that bowl hits the side of the altar, 4 big pieces spill out on it, and several smaller ones. And of course, they're going to brush them away really quick, but not before they burn through. And that burn pattern would have been, that went first, that went second, that went third, that went fourth. And it wouldn't have taken, but 3 seconds for that to happen. Okay. Next, 1201. We're in Constantinople, and the royal palace, they took inventory every year. Nicholas Meserites, he took inventory on all of the relics they had there, and among his inventory, he included the burial cindones of Christ, and these are of linen. 1204 was the sack of Constantinople, and that is another story in itself, but the shroud, along with many of the relics, disappears, so where did it go? Well, we have a couple of evidences that we know for certain it was there, because in 1204, 2 things happened. Number one, on the left there, you see A through G. Those are fold marks. Linen has a memory. When it's been folded, those creases are still there. So we know when it's folded in and out. And by following those fold marks, we know that it was folded like you see in the middle. And that little black square, see at the top center, the labeled F, that would be like a spool of wood. So it was placed inside a box, and there was a knight, Robert de Clary, one of the Crusader knights, who was in Constantinople in April of 1204. And he describes how he witnessed the shroud was venerated on Fridays. And he said this, I quote, "There was another of the churches which they called My Lady St. Mary of Blacherne, where was kept the cindones in which our Lord had been wrapped, which stood up straight every Friday, so that our Lord could be plainly seen." And it doesn't take too much imagination to imagine candles burning on each side of this. And every Friday, the shroud was raised up. So my point here is that those fold marks provide empirical evidence that the shroud was in Constantinople. And Robert de Clary's eyewitness account verifies that it was still there in April of 1204. Okay, the next period of shroud's history is known as the missing years. For the next 150 years, we're not really sure where it went. That's why we call them the missing years. But it shows up in Liray, France in 1355 by a knight named Geoffrey de Charnay. And from here on out, its history is very well documented. All right? Now, in 1453, his family passed it on to the House of Savoy. Now, the House of Savoy was a dynasty that ruled Europe. And that dynasty started in the 10th century and went all the way to the 20th century, 1946. The last king of Italy was the last of the Savoys, right? And while I was in Chambéry on the night of December 4th, 1532, a mysterious fire broke out, and the casket melted in that fire and produced all those holes that we see on it today with those patches. Okay, in 1578, Duke Philibert of Savoy brought the shroud over the Italian Alps to Turin, Italy, and he brought it to this St. John the Baptist Cathedral, and that is where it has been for the last 4 centuries, all right? The Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, that's why we call it the Shroud of Turin. It's in Turin, Italy, all right? Now, over the next few centuries, it was brought out for like important events, like royal weddings and things like May 4th was called Shroud Day, but notice how those corners are being held. I was able to attend a talk in St. Louis, and there were 42 scientific talks, and one of them was just dozens of slides showing how it was displayed, and some of them just grabbed that corner, and there's 6 inches hanging out of it. That's why these corners are missing. Right there where the laser's at, that is a backing. And right over here, that patch, that corner is missing. It was mishandled many times, and it became very contaminated. And every public display further contaminated those corners, right? And when we get to this corner here, you'll find out that was the area for the carbon dating test of 1988, probably the worst possible location they could have chosen. Okay, 1898, an amateur photographer, Secondo Pia, May 25th, was able to photograph the shroud for the first official picture. And as he was developing his black and white photo with silver nitrate glass, this picture emerged, and he nearly dropped it because it so surprised him. He was the first person to ever see this great detail, because when you look at the shroud, it's very faint, but when you look at that photographic negative, it really comes alive for you. And so this is where worldwide interest in the shroud began. Okay? All right, 19th century's down. Here's the 20th century. 1978, enter the Shroud of Turin research project. That man on the left is Dr. John Jackson. He's a PhD in physics. He taught he was a professor at Air Force Academy. He got a team of 33 scientists, and they were going to study the shroud to try and answer the question, how was the image formed? And here's a look at some of the places they came from. I won't read that to you, but Los Alamos is where they produced the atomic bomb, jet propulsion of the NASA, and disciplines anywhere from anatomy to x-rays and everything in between. This was an all-star team. Only 3 of them were Catholic, by the way. Okay? They weren't chosen to try and prove the resurrection. They were chosen trying to figure out how was the image formed. So for the next 3 years, they published all their data in 20 different professional scientific peer-reviewed journals. And they come up with a conclusion report, and in their summary report, they included these 3 facts. They could not answer the question, how was the image formed? But they could state this with certainty. Number 1, no paints, pigments, or dyes have been found on the image-bearing thread fibers. There is no stuff to that image. Secondly, it is not the work of an artist because of many reasons. There's 17 traits about the shroud. In the interest of time, I've just shown you the 3D one, superficiality, a couple of others. And then thirdly, we know of no chemical or physical methods that can account for the totality of that image. And so here we are 40 years later, and these 3 facts still hold up. And my point here is, this is good science. This has withstood the test of time and intense scientific scrutiny. 1983, you know, I told you the Savoys had it, right? Well, the last king of Savoy went to live in Portugal after Italy got a new form of government in 1946. What's going to happen to the shroud? In his will, he had deeded the shroud to the Pope, the Holy See. So now, for perhaps the first time since St. Peter himself, the shroud is in the possession of the successor to Peter. John Paul II, of course, was this Pope. 1997, April 11th, this was Good Friday. What a strange coincidence. On Good Friday, a mysterious fire breaks out. They never did determine. It was thought to be arson. But this is the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, and the shroud was normally kept right below there. Right? But a few weeks before, they had set up some scaffolding because they were going to do some work on the cupola, and they put the shroud down the aisles of the church there and anchored it into a stone wall in bulletproof glass. And so while the fire is raging, Mario Trematore grabs a sledgehammer, and he is pounding through that bulletproof glass. And it took him about a half an hour to get the hole big enough so that they could take the casket out. At that point, the shroud was rolled up like a poster. And on Holy Saturday morning after midnight, they rushed the shroud out of the burning cathedral, and the next day they unroll it to investigate, did it suffer any damage? And thankfully, there was no damage to the shroud, but for the next year, the shroud's whereabouts were kept secret because they were concerned someone was trying to destroy the shroud, and that threat remains today. This was the last public viewing of the shroud in 2015. Okay? It was shown 4 times last century, and it was shown in 2000, 2010, and 2015. So it'll likely begin shown again in your lifetime. When will that be? It's up to the Pope. If he wanted to put it on permanent display, like they have Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico City, he could do that. But it's up to the Pope to make that call. So we don't know when the next will be. 2025 is a holy year. We'll see if that happens then. Here's what the shroud looks like right now. Okay, down the middle you see a big black line. Those are extremely heavy glass, bullet-resistant doors. And it has a very elaborate security system with 24 armed guard around the clock. And they have the shroud inside an aluminum reliquary. It's not folded up anymore. And they removed all the oxygen from it, and they replaced it with argon. Argon is inert, doesn't react with anything, controlled temperature and humidity. So that's where the shroud is at as we speak. Now, in dating the shroud, there is one rogue item that occurred in history. 1988, there was a carbon dating test in 1988 that suggested that the shroud came from the year 1325, plus or minus 65 years. right? Now, carbon dating is still used today. However, it has a problem with contamination, so that about 20% of the time, 1 out of every 5 samples produces significant deviation, and it has to be thrown out. Here's some examples of those, right? Mummies and their linens should be the same age, but sometimes they date centuries apart. That's data you throw out. Seals don't live to be even 100 years old. Leaves, leaves come out in April, and then by November they fall on the ground. Leaves that are less than a year old sometimes have shown a carbon-12 to carbon-14 ratio, indicating that they're really 4 centuries old. So these are some examples of other ones that have been thrown out. And there's some other examples as well. Now, I wanted you to see where the carbon sample was taken from. On the right, you see the front of the body. Down in the corner is the right foot. And right where the laser's at on the wall, right here. This was the sample area. It's one of the dirtiest contaminated areas on the shroud, and they cut some pieces out of there. One of the pieces was cut off and given to the lab in Tucson, Arizona. One went to Zurich, Switzerland. One went to Oxford, England. And then because that first Arizona 1 piece was kind of small, they gave them a second piece, right? And these pieces were carbon dated. But the problem is the lab's data show a significant statistical slope that differs, that basically every inch it gets 91 to 97 years younger. So Oxford was younger than Arizona 2, and Zurich was younger than Oxford, and Arizona 1 was almost 300 years younger than Arizona 2. And so that type of deviation is such that it's considered to be significant. And to make a long story short, in 2019, they published the raw data. See, because when they published this in Nature magazine in 1989, they just showed, we think it's just old, but they didn't show the raw data. What did the instrumentation say? What was the data? And by the Freedom of Information Act, that data, it's a European law, international law, that was made public in April of 2019. And in that expose, it was shown that there was significant deviation. So in the scientific community, long story short, it's been declared invalid. So for people in the scientific community, the carbon dating test is no longer an issue. But I think for perhaps people in the general population, it may not be so. There may be a question about that. Okay, we got till 11:59, right? And we're right about 4. We got 10 minutes. We're in great shape. We are going to make it, okay? But few people are aware of alternative testing has been done since then. In 2015, they tried 3 modern methods of testing, and they placed the shroud in that range. Now, I'm going to put a graph up there because I think this might make it easier for you to understand, okay? Time is going to go across the bottom. Here we go. Down the bottom, that's 1000 BC, and on the right is 1500 AD. Does that make sense? We got time going left to right, old to new. Okay, then above them, those 3 green areas represent the ranges that these 3 other tests did. The first test, they take an infrared light and they reflect it off the sample, and the way it bounces back gives you an indication of its age. Kind of a big range. The second one is similar, only they use a laser. It too has a big range. The third test, see where it's called tensile strength, is where they get some control samples from museums at different centuries and they pull them apart. And the way they pull apart can give you an indication of the age. That too is a big range, but look where they overlap. They overlap in the 1st century. So my point here is that these 3 tests combined together give us a better indication of the shroud's age than just one of those tests by itself. Okay, well there's 2 areas that scientists are mainly interested in. Number 1, how was the image formed? And number 2, where was it at, especially during those missing years? And in the interest of time, we're just going to look at image formation here, okay? So how was the image formed? We can graph these into 3 groups, okay? Was it a natural process? That's the top 2, with the names associated with that. Was it an artist's work? That's the next 6. Or was it a radiation event? Was radiation the mechanism that put this image on there, okay? Now, these have been put onto a table, and don't worry about looking at the details on this, but I want to do this for a reason. I want you guys to understand that all 10 of these have been very scrutinized, right? And the first 2 up there, dead body alone, all right, those have to be ruled out because below them, those X's show that theory fails to account for superficiality. So we throw those out. Same thing with the 6 artists. Those too has discrepancies that can't explain those. Over on the far right are the 2 radiation hypotheses. Now there's actually 17 traits. The other traits are on the left. That's what the whole table looks like. It's called the truth table. But here's the point. On the far right-hand side, radiation, whether it was a coronal discharge of electrons or a burst of light with photons, radiation is the only serious area that's being studied for shroud image formation these days. So, but many times when you see shows on Learning Channel, Discovery Channel, History Channel, they tend to spend a great deal of time on the artist theories, but the artist theories have already been discarded because they're not superficial enough. They don't produce a 3D image, and all those other traits. So, what is a possible explanation? Here it is. If you only catch 3 slides today, these are the most important 3. You got everybody with me? Okay. Dr. Jackson first proposed this in 1989 at the Paris conference, known as the radiation fall-through hypothesis. All right? It satisfies all 17 shroud characteristics. All right? It states that if the mechanism for the superficial image on the linen fibers is that if there were a burst of light from the body, and the body became simultaneously mechanically transparent, then the linen would collapse through the body vertically in the downward direction of gravity, with the top flattening out, and as it fell, it would pull the sides outward so there'd be no side images. And this, in effect, accomplishes that vertical 3D mapping that I mentioned before, and that gets us back to one of those slides I showed you at the beginning. All right? Now, mechanically transparent. We all know what this means. If you think how Christ appeared to the apostles on Easter night, they're locked in the upper room, right? And he comes into their midst. How did he do that? How did he get through the locked door? Well, if you've accepted on faith that he came to the apostles, even though the door was locked, then you've accepted that he had a resurrected body that was mechanically transparent. It was not subject to the laws of nature, all right? But then the question becomes, when did that moment begin, right? And if that moment began at the moment of the resurrection, then this would be consistent with the shroud falling through a mechanically transparent body in the plane of gravity, accounting for a vertically aligned 3D image with no side images. Pope Benedict XVI said this. You know, every Sunday in the Nicene Creed, we express our belief in the seen and the unseen. And the seen is that which we can quantify, and observe. And the unseen are those things that we can't. God exists as a Trinity. Heaven, hell, and purgatory. The existence of angels, our soul. Those unseen realities that we believe in. He's saying those things don't force themselves on us. They don't have to be quantified. We can accept those on faith. So in wrapping this up here, I've summarized a lot of these things up here from the years, covered most of this with you. I had to cut out a few slides because we had to get this done in 50 minutes. But all of those go together. And if you put those on a scale, right? And they're on the left-hand side here. And on the right-hand side is that lone carbon dating test of 1988. Then I think each of you can come to your own reasoned judgment about which side of the scale you think carries the most convincing weight. Now, in 2014, I attended an international conference, and the man on the left there is Bishop Michael Sheridan of the Diocese of Colorado Springs, and he addressed the 160 scientists who were there in St. Louis, Missouri, and he said this: faith is about more than probability. The martyrs did not die because they thought that Christ is probably the Savior of the human race. They died in the certainty that he is. The difference between life and death is absolute. And to be so sure of something as to pay for it with one's own death is to be very sure indeed. Our faith rests on the reality of the resurrection and not on the authenticity of the shroud. But if it is authentic, then it is the most precious relic in the universe. A week after Easter, this is Caravaggio's Doubting Thomas. Thomas said, "Let me put my hand into his side where I won't believe." Thomas did that. And the shroud is a sacred sign that leads us to sanctify our lives through the divine grace that flows through the Christ's passion, death, and resurrection. Perhaps our response should be like that of doubting Thomas. All right, now, I know that in a group setting like this, Q&A is a little more difficult, so what I did was I've taken some of the more common questions, and just to finish up here, we'll be done here in 3 or 4 minutes, I thought I'd answer a few of those for you here, all right? When would go on display against up to the Pope? Next, there were 2 possibilities, all right? Dr. Frederick Zugby points right down here. Barbet says there, both of those are sufficient. If you want to ask me questions later, I'm going to be here all day till 4 o'clock. You can find me in the Commons, right? Those would result in the nails either going downward to the ground, the picture might fall off the wall, or if they were going outward, you'd be pinned down more. We think Zugaby's seem a little more likely, right? But it's an open question. DNA is difficult to test when it's many centuries old because DNA fragments. Chromosome 1 is like 189 million base pairs. It's busted into many pieces. You got pollen DNA on it. You got bacteria DNA on it. You just got a mixture there. We're probably not going to get a DNA test. Plus, what would you compare it with? DNA is a comparative thing. Okay, if you get this is the DNA of Jesus, what would you compare it with? Right? Physical miracles are not very numerous. They haven't been scrutinized to the degree that with the rigor. But there have been many spiritual miracles of people converting. I know of a Jewish man who wrote a book called From the Kippah to the Cross because the face on the shroud convinced him. Other artworks. In the 10th century, they noticed those exaggerated abdomen, all right, and where the laser's at right now. All right, we know that those watermarks are there probably by the 10th century. Okay, it was folded in a certain way. They don't know why the first carbon test produced bad results. So until you can determine the contamination, another carbon test is not going to tell you anything more. All right? There are actually 3 veils that are considered Veronica's veil. This one's the one in Montepello. Whether or not it is legit or not, I believe that is an open question, but there's 2 in Rome, 1 in Montepello, Italy. This is what the shroud looks like right now. I'm not going to take time for this one because I want to finish something else there. They did a restoration, and they stretched the shroud out to make it look like he's taller, but 5'10" was really the one.